All right, here we go. We are all set up. I am gonna try to watch the time and hopefully not take us more than 10 minutes over so that we can eat and everything. Sibuli, swakweku, ugatsanuni, G, wezwagedo, Dr. Wendi Sierra, niyugyats, Jerry, niyugyats agnul, Shirley, niyugyats agsod, Anayodaga, nii, nawal, niwakitalod, Gaya Degenhas, Gwewe. So, thanks to everyone for coming to hear this presentation about a strong fire. I will start out and say that it is playable on astrongfire.com. So if you want, in just a moment, I'm going to pop out and put it on the screen, but also feel free to go ahead and open it up and look at it yourself. I will say there is audio, so if you do pop it up on your phone or iPad or something, you might want to mute that before you do so. So let me go ahead and do that right now. Well, you know what? I think I already have it going. There it is. Cool. So I'm going to click through this just a little bit while I talk about the game. I'll start out with a sort of a brief history lesson. I have found through talking with students that not everybody knows about the Oneida or the Haudenosaunee, so I like to give that quick overview. Our name for ourselves is Anayodaga Ni'i, which means the people of the standing stone. But the official sort of federally recognized government name is Oneida. Like a lot of officially federally recognized tribe names, Oneida is actually an insult. There's some, like the etymology is contested, but people think that it comes from a sort of a French bastardization of an Algonquin word that means snake people. And that's our federal name. Interestingly, Haudenosaunee, which is I'm pointing up there, but you can't see my notes. Haudenosaunee is our name for our confederacy. Again, bastardized French name is Iroquois, which might be the name that you're more familiar with. Iroquois refers to the Six Nations and is not a federally recognized name. And we have been reasonably successful in shifting to using Haudenosaunee, our own name, which means people of the Longhouse, for the Confederacy. But for all of the Six Nations, the sort of federal names stick around for governmental reasons. The Oneida were originally in central New York. There are now 3 Oneida communities. There are still some in central New York. My family is from Wisconsin, so that's where the largest reservation is in Green Bay. And then there's also an Ontario community. So this game was funded by an NEH Digital Projects for the Public grant. We got $100,000 to make this prototype. The design process for this started obviously before we got that grant, though. It was about a year and a half's worth of meetings to talk about basically what would an Oneida game be? What would we want it to do? What would it look like? Who would it be for? Had a lot of meetings with the community, and there were some really interesting ideas that came up. One of them was something that was similar to Just Dance, but taught our dances, which I thought to myself, like, that's a really cool idea. I have no idea how to do that. But I loved it. There was also a lot of conversation about maybe teaching raised beadwork, which is one of our traditional crafts. But ultimately, over and over from everyone we spoke with, language kind of came up as the most vital. And there's a couple reasons for this. First of all, on this screen, you'll see Ukwayawena right here, which is the word for the language. You also heard that word in my introduction when I said, Geyadgen has Ukwayawe, Geyadgen has, I am helping. Ukwayawe, that's our word for Oneida. It also means the original people, and Ukwayawena means the original language, so I love that there's like a little shade built into that, right? Like, I don't know what y'all are speaking. I'm speaking the original language. So the people, the language, the culture, they all get referred to under this Ukweawe word. And there's this sense that if we lose the language, we lose the culture. We're not Oneida. Our way of thinking, our way of understanding the world is never truly understood in English. So you've got to know the language or you've lost something. So obviously for that reason then, language seemed like something important to make a game about. Um, we also have lots of language initiatives going on. So there's an immersion preschool that is one of the main use cases for this game. There are Oneida classes at our elementary school and at some local schools. And then there's all sorts of, both through our language department and through the other communities, language classes for adults. So this game is really kind of made to complement all of those things, not to replace them, but to just be a little interesting added component. I'll go to Ukiyo-e now real quick. There we go. So the Ukiyo-e version is 100% in Oneida. One of the things that you'll notice, and I'll just go through a couple screens here, is that the Oneida is much shorter than the English. So it's not a direct translation of the English. This is the way an Oneida speaker would say it, and then we've kind of Englishified the Oneida in the other version. And this is partially because one of the audiences is that immersion preschool, and they don't want any English in what they're doing. So we needed a completely Oneida version for that. Now I'll get out and go back to the English version. Click over here. All right. So now we'll hear this again. So in the read section, the idea is that you're going to learn 8 words in Oneida. The words are a mix of story-related nouns. So here we have oniganus. Oniganus comes up a whole ton in our creation story. Previously we had ganaguchlio. That is a verb that means to have a good mind. So we've sort of split between nouns related to the story that kids can use to get them engaged, and the verbs that really share our values. Oneida is a heavily verb-based language, and so coming up with that balance of nouns and verbs and like what are kids going to get and use and say versus what do we want to convey was really tricky. And again, here you can see this is much longer than when we saw this screen in Oneida, right? Because we've tried to Englishify where we're using the Oneida in this language, in the trans language version. So I'll click through a couple of these screens just real quick. Later on, there's more interaction in this part, but for right now, we're kind of just clicking through. Some of this is funding related. We got 100,000 from the NEH to make this, and money spends quickly. That's that's what I'll say about that. So we had initial plans for a lot more interaction in some of these sections, and a lot of that got cut. There's just a couple I want to show you. I'll mention while we're clicking through this. The art was based on concept art by Dawn Darkmountain, who is an Oneida watercolor artist. So it's based on her traditional style. And then the game design company I worked with, and I'll chat about them in a minute, translated that into the game art in a way that is amazing. So here's part of it. So here you click on the tree roots, the tobacco, and the strawberry to help Sky Woman. Oh, I skipped through. My favorite art in this is just before this, when she asks Lunque to get her the roots, and he doesn't, and she's just standing there like so over it. Bro, come on. I'll point out, so if you click on these, you can see the definition. And you get to hear the words spoken by a child. I'll talk about that in a minute. That was somewhat contentious. So we wanted these to mostly be things that you can understand from context. So you see Yoji just falling, you know that Yoji just refers to the woman that's falling. She's falling into Oniganus, so you can put together that that's water. But obviously not everything is going to work that well, right? Asea de Genha might be kind of hard for you to guess from context. So we have 3 speakers that worked with us. We have the child, we have this woman, and then we have an elder, so that you're hearing the language at all different levels. Here we go. So here's some of it. So on this screen, you actually can't pick the right animal. He's not on there yet. So you have to at least once go through this loop where you pick an animal who can't help, they dive down, they come up, they tell you that they couldn't help. All right. And so now muskrat is here. So now you can click on muskrat. I love this tubby little guy. Yeah. So I want you to remember this image of muskrat, because I'm going to talk about this in just a second too. I don't know if you know the story, but muskrat's not doing well right there. This actually is only checking movement. You can do anything. So I'll just, like, I'm not moving in a circle, but it's still going. Awesome. So there's that bit. Click over here to play real quick. So we've got the interactive narrative. You learned Asea de Genha. You learned Dehona Tela Dux. Lunque, Yojijas, right? A mixture of culturally important verbs, which are our values, and then story-related nouns. And then you come over here and you get a chance to practice those. So there is a match 3 game. And this is actually where this whole project started. I made a way less beautiful version of this on my phone in Unity just to help my own language learning, because I'm a language learner myself. I'm 100% not proficient. I can like conjugate the verb to eat, and I know a couple important phrases. So I don't know how much of this we need demonstrated. I'm going to talk about mentoring just a little bit, but I do want to highlight, since we've got Oni Ganus up there, we had our artist Dawn Dark Mountain mentor a young Oneida artist, and so she made both this concept art and the concept art for Turtle. Hopefully we see it in a minute, but we'll find out. And talk to her not only about the traditional style, but also about like, what does it mean to be a working Native artist? How do you do that? How do you set up a studio and make a living this way? So that was a really important part of this project, was not just doing the thing, but also being accountable to the community and thinking about how the game project would lift up the community, not just by its mere existence, but in the design as well. Also, the music that we're doing is composed by a Stockbridge composer, Brett Michaels Davids, and he worked with a Dene student and did the same thing, right? They composed together. He normally does film, and so she did a lot of conversation with him about like, oh, there's the turtle. The turtle was also done by the apprentice. We had a lot of arguments between the composer and the animators about who had to get their stuff done first.
Oh, God.
The animators said, no, compose your music so that we can time to your music. And the composer said, like, no, make your game so I can tie to the emotional beats of what you're doing in the game. And it was just a constant, like.
Did you ever come up with a solution to that? Like a compromise space where it worked a little better, or did it just?
Ultimately, the animators lost on that one. We told the animators, like, you do the thing and then give it to him, because he was just like, set, I'm not doing it this way. But it was a big, that was a big shift. All right, let me hop back into my presentation over here. Had to make sure I got through all my notes. Okay, cool. So as I already mentioned a little bit, the game was funded by an NEH grant. It was the Digital Projects for the Public grant. One of the nice things about having to do the grant is that we had to lay out the design process very, very rigidly in advance. I want to say it ended up being like an 80-page grant proposal. So we had our values right at the front, and we made sure we were always coming back to those. Whenever possible, we worked with Oneida first, and then if not with Oneida, then with Indigenous, and only if we couldn't do that, then did we work with non-Indigenous people. We tried as much as possible to create multiple opportunities for feedback and response. I won't go too much into that happened, but I will just tell you that our grant kickoff was March 1st, 2020. So, and then the other thing that was super important to us was to think about how we could share the parts of the culture that are meant to be shared. So this is a Digital Projects for the Public grant. It's not just for the Oneida people. And it was a lot of navigation in terms of thinking about what that meant for the project. There was a real concern that getting the language publicly available and out there would somehow have negative repercussions, that someone would somehow monetize this, would somehow take something from this, and that we would be the worst for it. And I think that you can understand why Native people might be concerned about that, right? And so like that alone was a real roadblock. The fact that this thing is just sitting on a website publicly available. Initially, they asked, could we put it behind the members only login on our Oneida Nation site? So that was definitely a challenge we had to navigate. Here we go. So balancing stakeholders was pretty important for this project, and we had a couple. The NEH requires some official humanities advisors, so those are all academics. I was fortunate enough to work with some great scholars, all of whom are Indigenous, one of whom was Oneida, who did some feedback. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Beth LaPense. Yeah. So she was on this grant, and she was one of the advisors. She has game design experience and has worked on language games before, so just having her was incredible. Obviously, also the Oneida community, and that's a much more amorphous group to try to pay attention to. So there were a couple of official bodies that we worked with, the language department, the community center. Those official bodies all got furloughed and shut down during COVID. So we relied on them as much as we could, but we ended up using a lot of family connections, parents, children, people working on the project, friends of people working on the project. It was a very grassroots method to get this thing out there and then to get feedback on it because of when our project started and how the shutdowns hit. And then we worked with Second Avenue Learning, which is an ed tech studio in Rochester, New York, who is non-native. So, oh, you can't see this because that's up there. Oh, well, I'll leave it there. The heading, oh, there it goes. The heading says make the muskrat more dead, which is some of the feedback that we got. So one of the first questions was, what story should we do? If you're only going to hear one story about the Oneida people, if you never heard about the Oneida people before, and this is the first thing you're hitting, what should that story be? That was a big conversation. And ultimately we decided, well, the creation story shares our values of reciprocity, of helping, of being thankful. So that seems like a natural one. Also, creation story just feels like a good place to start, right, in the beginning. Um, which then led us to the second problem. There are roughly 18 versions of the creation story, depending on who you're talking to and what counts as a version. I think one of the interesting things is that, like, none of these are wrong. They just tell you something different. You learn something different when you hear a different version of the creation story. Maybe it tells you a thing that you need to hear in that moment that you didn't need to hear sooner. So some of the things that change. Well, what happened before Sky Woman got pregnant? Moreover, who got Sky Woman pregnant? And our story sort of implied that in Slunkwe, and other stories, it's a chief. There's another version of the story where it's a lacrosse player who turns into stardust as she falls. And she's not pregnant when she starts falling, but she is when she gets to the ground. So how and when did she get pregnant? That's one of the things that varies. And then finally, why did she fall? In the version that we ended up using, she goes to get to the roots and she then just kind of like accidentally falls. In some versions, she is pushed. In some versions, there's like accusations of infidelity. So we had to sort of sort through and decide, well, which version are we going to use? And then finally, obviously, we had to deal with some tricky material, right? This is generally considered the preschool version. It's got most of the good things that they all have. But that muskrat is dead. That's a very important part of the story, right? He sacrifices himself to bring that dirt back up and then to create the world. But we want to send this game out to non-native elementary school kids who may or may not appreciate a dead muskrat in their game, or elementary teachers who may or may not appreciate a dead muskrat in their game. I would argue Disney does a lot worse than just a dead muskrat, but nonetheless, we tried to be kind of cagey with how dead the muskrat looked, and that was one of the first pieces of feedback we got when we sent it out to Oneida parents and children, like, your muskrat's not dead enough. So we did have to go back to the artist, who said that this was the most entertaining criticism she had ever gotten, and say, can you give him more of a gentle repose? Let's see, other design challenges. The game company that I was working with, Second Avenue Learning, really felt that we needed some fail states in those mini games. They had done vocabulary-based mini games before, which is where they got the model for this one. And in their testing with elementary school kids, they felt like having some sort of a timer element was important to keep them motivated and engaged. So they were very adamant, like, timer's going to be great, kids are going to love it, this is going to be wonderful. In contrast, the Oneida community hated that idea. I see other people here are also against that idea. There are lots of reasons that people speak or don't speak Oneida, and many of them are associated with trauma. So it was very, very important for us that we don't create any shame in this game, that you should never feel bad when you are playing this game. And so we wanted to really focus on creating a positive relationship with the language. So this was a sort of a early, the game company was trying to push back, and said, like, no, this is not what we want. And so now in the mini game section, things count up, nothing counts down. There's not like, you can just sit on that screen forever if you want. There is no fail state in it. Another challenge that we thought about was how to create authenticity. In other words, for Oneida people playing this game, how do we make it feel authentically Oneida? And basically, my idea was, like, in a sense, Easter eggs. So there are all sorts of things in the game that are culturally significant that I would bet if I didn't point them out to you, many of you would not notice, including the title, A Strong Fire. So this comes from an aphorism that is sort of like a statement of our values: a good heart, a good mind, a strong fire. And if you think back to the beginning, I told you that Haudenosaunee means people of the longhouse, and that's not just like people who live in ranches, right? But the longhouse is a symbol for our community connection. So a longhouse was a multi-generational and often multi-family dwelling. So the people of the the longhouse is the people of the community, right? The people who have that community relationship with each other. And a strong fire is a symbol for the fire of that longhouse, right? So if you have a strong fire, you have a strong community. You have a connected, engaged community. Some other things, and maybe I'll pop out again and go back to the game slowly. Some other things that are, like I said, sort of little Easter eggs that we tried to do to make it more authentic. The domes at the top next to a strong fire are sky domes. So that design references Sky World. It's a symbol of Sky World. The belt that's on the background of the memory game right here is the Hiawatha belt, which is the symbol of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Come back over here for a second. When we start the game off, this is actually a view inside a longhouse. So this is like what a longhouse would have looked like. I won't go all the way through it again, but when we get to the part where you spread the dirt, I don't know if you noticed you spread it counterclockwise. In our story, that is how Sky Woman spread it. And so many of our dances are done counterclockwise, not clockwise, right? But we tried to make sure we had little things like that. Yeah, I think I covered them. Little things like that all throughout the game, so that if you're an Oneida player, you're kind of seeing all of this visual imagery and you're saying like, yes, this is for me. This is of us, for us. The music is also, one of the songs is based on the Robin dance, which is a traditional dance. So, see if I can make my way back into presentation view. It was also important to have accountability, as I mentioned in this project. I'm trying to find a place to put that. And to make sure that the design was done in a really community-based reciprocal way. So I mentioned the music mentorship, the art mentorship. There was also plans for a game design mentorship program. I was supposed to go run a summer camp for Oneida youth and teach them, well, like high schoolers. Feels like youth to me. And teach them like intro to Unity. We were going to use the sandbox and do some stuff with that. Because of COVID, that got canceled, and so we created a production assistant role that did what those funds were meant to do. The mentoring got substantially delayed and then ended up having to be virtual. I think they both had good experiences, but we had wanted that to be like an in-person connection type of thing, and that just ultimately didn't work. Recruitment became a ton more challenging because powwow was canceled, general tribal business meetings were canceled, like everything was canceled. And then the cultural institutions, when they did finally open, were incredibly overtaxed. A lot of the Oneida cultural institutions are sustained by the Oneida Casino, which then provides the funding for them. So there's sort of a lag between like when the casino finally reopened and then when the cultural institutions reopened. There we go. So future goals for where we're going with this. This got a prototyping grant, which means we basically made the vertical slice that you saw there, the one interactive narrative and the 2 mini games to go with it. We want to create 8 to 10 more mini games based on the, 8 to 10 more interactive narratives based on the Ganahilagusla, which is the Thanksgiving address. We want to add more interactivity into the narratives. We've had ideas that like you would click a tree and it would wave and tell you the word for tree or things like that. Those didn't make it into this version. I was mentioning this earlier. The mini games that we have just teach vocab, right? But we want to create mini games that teach grammar. And so we've been working with the tribe to think about like, what would that look like for our audience? And then finally, we want to create more mentoring opportunities for the community to think about how we can encourage, and this is sort of my like hidden backdoor goal, how can we encourage more Native youth to see themselves in games and then eventually to see themselves in game design, to imagine that this is a path that they could follow and be successful and also contribute to their community, right? So that's sort of the underlying goal. There's Tubby Muskrat again. I love him so much. That's the concept art. So, yeah, we'll go. Thank you very much. Oh, this is the piece that Don Dark Mounted created for us, in addition to other smaller pieces, but this was the big one. Awesome. Thank you. Happy to answer any. Go for it.
You had mentioned that there had been some controversy about having children.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to.
Yes, I forgot to. I went right by that.
And how you navigate it.
So, from the Works Progress Administration, funding like the 30s and 40s, right? We have a ton of recordings of Oneida. They're archived at University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's all elders speaking. We have a dictionary that's online at UWGB, all elders speaking. And there's a real concern about correctness. I think that this is something, I mean, this is the only endangered language that I have experience with, but I think that there's a distinction between teaching a non-endangered language and an endangered language. There's this real fear about being correct. And so I was really adamant, I want kids' voices in this thing. I want kids to hear people who sound like them, right? Sounds that they're going to be able to replicate, sounds that they're going to understand. And that was a very controversial stance in the tribe because there's a sense that the elders say things correctly. The youth don't always say things correctly. And so all of our models should be elders. And we went around with a circle on this. And I'm not the only one that has sort of encountered this. The immersion school encounters this a lot as well because you know, we were talking about native and non-native speakers. For Oneida people, we talk a lot about first language and second language speakers. And the preference is your first language speakers. But in my community, there are no more first language speakers. So people who grew up with Oneida as the first language they spoke. So yeah, having the 3 different voices was something that I really had to argue for and essentially persuade the language department, like, no, it's important. This is why it matters, and show them other language games. And even then, after it came out, I did hear some conversation about like, well, probably should have gotten a first language speaker. Well, on the next one, maybe you ought to get a first language speaker. But I just kind of, that to me felt more important to have the kids hearing a voice that mattered. So yeah, that was something that I really, really pushed for. Yeah.
I think this conversation about authenticity is very contentious because our notion of authenticity is very deceptive.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't respond well to human negotiation and evolution over time, especially with an endangered language where you're like trying to prop something up, but without thinking, oh no, languages are alive. Mm-hmm. One thing about teaching grammar, though, is that, especially because you're talking about these are always sort of second language acquisition. Well, you learn grammar through second language and actually don't understand grammar totally in your first language. There is a way in which, like, just fundamentally going after grammar concepts in any language that's a foreign language will reflect and enrich your own understanding of your own language. So how do we do that with the game?
Yeah, I mean, that's the net that we're trying to crack. And Oneida is generally very, very different from English. I'll back up. So one of the things that I did here, man, I wish you could see the top. Can I move this bar at all? Nope. Yeah, you're not.
You can't move my bar.
Oh, you know what? I'll make it smaller. Bam. Ah, now you can see it. So Oneida is a language of verbs, verbing, verbs.
Exactly. This is
Well, and that's one of the reasons that, here we go, here's a good example. That's one of the reasons that I think that the community puts such a strong emphasis on learning the language because you always have to know your relationship. It's very difficult to do passive voice in Oneida, right? You always need to know the doer of the action. You always need to know the receiver of the action. Because that's going to tell you what form of the verb you need to use. And usually that is built into the verb. So here, Wagatsun and me, the waga is I. Oh, K's are G's. K's are G's and D's are I's, but TSI is a J. Don't think too much about it. So the WAKA is I, and then the Atsa Nu is the verb for being happy, but it's specifically an animate being being happy toward another animate being, right? If I were happy toward my lunch, it would be a different verb, right? So that's in there. And then the ni is the you, but I've added the G because I'm really emphasizing just like I'm happy that you, like, no, specifically all of you. So I'm emphasizing you in that, right? So one of the things that we've thought about doing, because you can usually break the verbs into the prefix, which is the pronoun, the stem, and then a suffix that's usually related to direct object is something like I don't know, like a spinner game where you can spin it around and then see different things happening on screen based on what's happening. So yeah, we've been really trying to get at how we can not just do vocab, but also grammar, because one of the words in the game is Asayadegenha, help her, but Yadegenha is the verb, and then actually that pronoun at the front changes a couple of times depending on who's doing the helping. Everybody's always helping her, so the rest of it is usually the same. But that's something that is very not clear in the game. You just see this different word that means help her in a couple different contexts. So yeah, I don't feel like we have good answers for that, but we're definitely thinking about it. There is a Ganengaha, a Mohawk verb constructor that's online, and you can kind of do some of this. Like you answer basically a whole bunch of questions. Who's doing the action? When are they doing the action? What is the action? Who is the action being done to, right? And then it spits out, here's your verb. But you don't get to see that constructive process.
right.
And I like the idea that like I could shift that waga to, you know, like a jigatsununi or something and see how that changes the meaning. So, yeah. Right.
Yeah, I was very interested in the debate that you all had about the concept of fail states, and also curiously the idea that kids love timers. I was curious, just for you personally, were there times where you felt like your passion for cultural authenticity and representation came into conflict with your own sensibility about what makes a good game, and so how you thought about resolving conflict?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things right at the front when we said we want to do an interactive narrative. Like, I mean, the Sky Woman story is the Sky Woman story, and there's not a lot of. I mean, obviously there are different versions, but there's not a whole lot of changing that you can do on that, right? And so that was even like one of the very first things that we thought about is, well, where are the opportunities for players to do things, and what would it mean for players to make choices in this environment? And we were able to work in a couple, but I do personally regret that it's not even until later in the game where some of those come up, and that's sort of a mix between the story and the budget. Even like, I mean, obviously the animation was quite a bit. Most of the budget on this game in the development side went into the art, right? But even like translation was not a small part of the budget. And we were sort of, again, stuck by COVID. Usually the way that we would get a new translation of a story is we would tell some elders what we want, and they would go and talk about it and have a conference about it, and they would go back and forth, over the weekend and at the barbecue and wherever they go, and then eventually they would all debate on the different ways that it would be said, and then they would give us a translation. Those types of events just weren't happening, so we had to rely on one translator who was then uncomfortable about the fact that he was the sole translator. And so we tried to minimize how much of that we were doing, and in fact the Oneida that we used for the Ukwelina version was an existing translation that we got permission to use, and then he did some minor tweaks to make it fit various places, but he was basing everything off of it. Oh, I have one more quick. When you started to ask that question, my head went in a different direction because I went to this project because I was teaching game design at my college. I had made these little mini games for myself for my language learning. And then on this project, I became a project manager. I didn't do any of the actual coding on this project. And what I learned is I went into academia because I don't want to be a manager. That's not what I like at all. So negotiating between all of these different stakeholders, tracking down people for funding, finding somebody's W-9s, right? That was not an enjoyable part of the process. And I'm actually now working on a side project in addition to continuing this project, just because I want to be building things. I want to have my hands in the dirt. And as the game director on this, I was very much not in the dirt, and that was sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation process. Also, I have so many questions, but focus on one follow-up question about the game. So it occurs to me, and I love it, there's so much thought went into language, culture, was aspects. I'm working with cultural competence and cultural community, socio-cultural competence. So you see where I'm going with
Yeah.
So when I heard the question, you have a conflict between thinking about what would make a good game, the training, right? I hope I'm not insulting now because I don't want to be. But it occurs to me that also in game design, all is Western-based stuff.
Yeah.
And so part of me really loves the idea that the people you talk to push back and said, no, we don't like it.
Yeah.
So there's a part of me that really loves it, but I can also see the conflict, right? So there's a lot going on in my mind. I'm curious about what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you see it in the things that you get to do in the game, right? Like the actions that you take. You are always helping the Sky Women. So you're grabbing the tobacco and the strawberry for her as she falls. You're helping her spread the dirt. And that's very intentional because that's one of those big values that we want to come out of this game is that idea of reciprocity, of connectedness, and of helping and thanking and giving things. One of the ideas that we've had that didn't work into this game, but we're hoping to do it in the next one, is a cooking game. And part of this is my kid is obsessed with Baby Bus. I don't know if anybody's seen this, man. It's like Steam for 4-year-olds. They're cell phone games, and they push out all of their mini games for kids. She loves it. But they have a ton of cooking games, and it's help so and so make this, and then the mechanics are mixing or spreading or baking or whatever. And so we've thought about trying to work something like that in because again that's that connection, right? You're making and sharing food, and that would be a great way to work in a Three Sisters story or something like that.
So, I came in late, so I just want to clarify, you yourself are not Oneida or Wendi, correct?
I am Oneida.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
I am so
Yeah.
sorry.
You missed the whole.
That's why. I just, I don't want to make assumptions, so thank you for clarifying that, I feel.
Yep. Yeah.
But, since you are bridging the gap between Oneida and non-native, I am somebody who is hoping to work on a project that concerns a culture that is not my own, so I want to ask, what advice would you have for somebody like me who and try to create content for a culture that is not my own?
Yeah, I think that some of that is going to depend on the culture and what their history is. Native peoples in general are incredibly suspicious of non-native people wanting to do things because historically that has not gone well for us. In fact, one of the language consultants on this grant said, I'll be on your grant as long as you don't have an anthropologist on your grant. Like I won't work with any anthropologists, right? And so if you were going to want to work with a native community, I would say the most important thing is to start with building that personal relationship to the community, understanding what the community wants and needs, what they value, and then looking for what they're already doing and seeing if there are ways that you can contribute to what they're already doing, right? To things they've already identified. I think what that process looks like is gonna vary depending on what the other culture is. Native American cultures have a very particular set of concerns and ways that they respond. And it's not even amongst tribes. There are something like 571 registered tribes. So people are going to respond differently depending on what tribe you're talking about. But that's generally what I would say. Start with listening, start with engaging in the projects they're already on, and start with understanding what they value first. I mean, even with this project, I just had it in my notes. Even with this project, as a community member, I still started with about a year of listening and just going to different events and talking to people. Some focus groups, some informal, some work with the art center, the community center, the language center, general business council, right? Just trying to get a sense of like, what are we already doing? And two, what would we care about, right? And it wasn't until I felt confident enough in what I had heard and the idea that I had that I actually moved on to putting together the grant and applying for funding. So, yeah. I don't want to run over our lunch.
Yeah.